By the middle of the 16th century, the Reformation was proving both a help and a hindrance to the emergent nation-state. This concept that sovereign states with recognized political borders and encapsulated a people with shared ethnic or cultural identity had begun emerging in the late Middle Ages. The leaders of these nation-states sought to solidify their control over their territories through various means, and very often through working with religious institutions. However, the Reformation called that relationship into question, and when critics of the state could suddenly use a different religious identity to gather supporters, kings and emperors found themselves facing sustained battles, sometimes ideological, oftentimes physical, to maintain control. The story of the Reformation in England and in France are a good example of these kinds of battles. Though Henry VIII didn't know it yet, he'd have all of his heirs by the end of 1537. Thanks to the Second Act of Succession, only the youngest heir, his son Edward, was legitimate. Henry would remarry 3 more times in an effort to have more heirs, but by the mid-1540s, he'd come to realize that Edward was his best chance for a continued Tudor dynasty. Nonetheless, he worried. Accordingly, in 1543, Henry pushed for, and Parliament passed, a 3rd Act of Succession. This one explicitly named both Mary and Elizabeth heirs to their brother Edward. In other words, it re-legitimized them. Henry's will, affirmed as legal by Parliament a year later, further indicated a line of succession beyond Elizabeth should she die without issue. This 3rd Act, which explicitly determined the primacy of a male heir over older female siblings, essentially governed British succession until 2013, when the Crown Act of 2013 guaranteed succession by primogeniture regardless of gender. In 1547, Parliament further passed a Treason Act to protect the line of succession established by Henry's will in 1544. This act made it illegal to try and change Henry's desired stated line of succession. Henry died shortly thereafter, and his son Edward duly became Edward VI. Edward had just turned 9. As we might expect, Edward had a privileged upbringing. While his sisters were estranged from their father, at least until 1543, both of them visited their younger brother often, and the 3 exchanged letters. While Edward was surrounded by Reformation sympathizers, the 10 articles that had been adopted by his father ensured that his early childhood was essentially a Catholic one. Edward VI would never reign on his own. Given his age, a regency council was appointed, led at first by his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, as Lord Protector. By this time in history, the Privy Council, the monarch's closest advisors, had grown considerably more Reformation-minded, and Edward's late childhood would be marked with a decided shift toward Reformation theology. As this happened, Edward actually lost popularity, because the shift was essentially Calvinist, and Calvinism was not popular in England at that time. His government's sustained persecution of prominent Catholics didn't help. Unsuccessful wars with Scotland led to the fall of his uncle as Lord Protector and the elevation of the first Duke of Northumberland into that position. Northumberland was unapologetically Protestant, and he encouraged Edward to start thinking about marriage — Edward was about to turn 13 — and the Tudor succession. This question became more urgent in January of 1533, when Edward fell ill with a chronic fever and just couldn't quite seem to get well. He drew up his own line of succession, ignoring both the 3rd Act of Succession and the Treason Act of 1547, ultimately naming his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who'd interestingly recently married the Duke of Northumberland's younger son, as his heir. Edward would die in July, 4 months shy of his 16th birthday. Historians believe he either died of tuberculosis or bronchopneumonia. This is based on the notes left by the autopsy performed by his physician. While Northumberland forced the coronation of his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, Parliament and the English people never accepted it. Mary sent a letter to the Privy Council insisting on her succession to the throne as per the Act of Succession, but the Privy Council initially rejected her claims, declaring her illegitimate. However, news of the fact that Mary had enormous support across England quickly caused them to reverse course, and Mary was named the Queen of England in mid-July. Mary was 37 years old when she became, as most historians agree, the first woman monarch of England. Mary had been raised Catholic by her mother, and her succession was greeted with great rejoicing as there had been a backlash against Edward and his Reformation policies. She worked to return England to the Roman Catholic Church. It was her number one concern. She persecuted and executed Protestants who protested the return. Her government's actions, about 280 Protestant dissenters were burnt at the stake during her reign, and hundreds more were imprisoned, earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, which was used by her critics to try and discredit her reign. While Mary was an accomplished individual, she'd never thought she'd rule England. Remember, she'd been deemed illegitimate from 1533 until 1544, when the Third Act of Succession went into effect. So she sought to secure a political marriage who would bring a strong husband as a good monarch for England. Her cousin, Charles V, who was considering retirement from the Holy Roman Empire, suggested that Mary might marry his son, Philip of Spain, both to stabilize England and to help her return England to Catholicism. Parliament was aghast at this idea, fearing Habsburg control of England, but Mary went ahead with it anyway, sparking revolts throughout the country, even in areas previously loyal to Mary. Well, Philip, who was already a widower, was a regent of Spain, but he did not yet hold the title of King of Spain, so he wasn't considered Mary's equal politically, and this was also a concern. Unfortunately, their marriage was not a happy one. Philip didn't spend much time in England, and Mary ended up letting her advisors just run the country. Unfortunately, besides the religious issue, Mary's 5-year reign was marked by natural disasters, such as bad harvests, which led to famine, economic downturn, such as the loss of the Flanders trade, as it faltered because new luxury fabrics were coming in from the east, and the loss of England's last port in France, Calais. Further, Mary experienced false pregnancies during her marriage, and then she succumbed to what historians believe was either ovarian cysts or uterine cancer, either of which might have given her the conditions in which she thought she was pregnant. When Mary died, in November of 1558, she left an England that was still locked in Reformation tensions and revolts. Her younger sister Elizabeth was immediately named the next Queen of England, as per the Third Act of Succession. Elizabeth was thus the third of Henry VIII's children to ascend the throne. She was 25 years old at the time of her accession. Now, she understood that her biggest political issue, at least initially, was going to be this religious question. Like Charles V, who died a mere 2 months before Elizabeth became queen, she understood that religion had become a toy for those who aspired to greater political power. If she intended to keep and maintain that power for herself as queen, and she did, then she'd have to act to ensure the religious issue was settled. Most notable, then, is her Elizabethan settlement, which firmly established the Anglican Church as a Protestant one, while it allowed individual worshippers to keep those rites and traditions that they held most dear. This settlement consisted of 2 acts of Parliament, which reiterated Elizabeth's commitment to a Protestant church. In 1559, Parliament passed a new Act of Supremacy, which re-established the Anglican Church's independence from the Catholic Church. Mary had revoked the original Act of Supremacy 5 years prior. Since so many were scandalized by the thought that a woman would be the head of the Anglican Church, this same act specified that Elizabeth was instead the supreme governor of the Anglican Church. The Act of Uniformity, passed the same year, was a compromise, edited from a more ambitious, more Protestant Reformation bill that hadn't passed Parliament. First, Elizabeth wanted to ensure that England moved away from Catholicism, so she made it a legal obligation for every Christian English subject to attend an Anglican service every Sunday. Those who did not attend would be fined, and if they refused to attend, would be jailed. Next, Elizabeth wanted to tackle not only the Anglican worship service, which was edited to delete any mention of the Pope, but kept the basic liturgy, the basic structure of the Catholic Mass, and she also wanted to address the Anglican Church's belief in communion. Elizabeth wanted to adopt a more Lutheran idea of the Eucharist, more sacramental union, instead of the vague wording that the 10 Articles adopted, which maintained a belief in transubstantiation. But there was substantial disagreement with that last issue in Parliament, and instead, Parliament approved wording which allowed for individual believers to either believe transubstantiation or sacramental union when it came to the Anglican Eucharist service. Finally, a new Book of Common Prayer was adopted. This book, which included Anglican prayers, songs, and the liturgy, the structure of the service, reflected the changes of this Elizabethan settlement. Important, of course, is the fact that the Elizabethan settlement allowed Elizabeth to focus on other pressing matters, those more political in nature, as the ones covered in your textbook. All the religious changes were accomplished in the first 2 years of her reign, but they did not mark the end of her participation in Reformation politics. In fact, she often engaged in Reformation politics in a way that was unique to political leaders who happened to be women. In the 1560s and early 1570s, Elizabeth would play mostly with the idea of political marriage. Historians generally agree that she was in love with a childhood friend, Robert Dudley. Elizabeth would eventually make him the Earl of Leicester. But her closest advisors, as well as a good proportion of the nobility, were adamantly opposed to any sort of marriage between Elizabeth and Robert. As a result, in the 1560s, as Elizabeth entered her 30s, she entertained the possibility of marriage to Eric XIV of Sweden, who was a Lutheran monarch, as well as to Henry, the Duke of Anjou, a Catholic, and even to Charles, the Duke of Austria, who was the third son of Ferdinand I, Holy Roman Emperor. Additionally, she entertained, although not seriously, her former brother-in-law, Philip II, also a Catholic. In the 1570s, during her 40s, she very briefly considered marriage to Francis, the Duke of Anjou, Henry's younger brother, who was 22 years younger than she, and, yes, a Catholic. But when she hit her late 40s, Elizabeth no longer considered marriage for the sake of an heir, but rather for political gain. And seeing that there was none, she remained single. As this marriage intrigue was ongoing, however, another, more sinister intrigue was also afoot. Despite the fact that she entertained marriage into the French royal family, Elizabeth was actually incredibly concerned about the French influence in Scotland. You see, the French supported the return of Mary, Queen of Scots, to the throne. Mary was a granddaughter of Henry VII, and as such, she was Elizabeth's cousin. Her mother was a well-connected French woman, also named Mary, from the Guise family. As a child, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been betrothed to Francis, then a prince of France, whom she married when she was 16 in 1558. This was the same year that Elizabeth became the Queen of England. Francis unfortunately died unexpectedly in 1560, leading to Mary's impending return to Scotland as a widow. Mary was a Catholic, and she returned to a Scotland that, at least in the lowlands, had become largely Protestant. Protestant nobility was supported by Elizabeth. There were many Catholics in England, however, as well as in Scotland, who viewed Mary as the legitimate heir to the English throne, since Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate by both Henry VIII and Edward VI at one time. Elizabeth tried to neutralize this threat in 1564, suggesting a marriage between her cousin Mary and Robert Dudley, but both parties refused, and Mary then wed the Earl of Darnley, with whom she had a son in 1566. Darnley, though, had wed Mary for his own political gain. While Mary was pregnant, Darnley murdered her secretary while Mary was forced to watch. Darnley was most likely trying to provoke Mary's miscarriage and her death, so that he'd become the King of Scotland. Darnley was declared an outlaw and was not so secretly assassinated in February of 1567 by James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, whom Mary then wed months later. Mary's decision to wed the Earl of Bothwell led the Scottish nobles to see Mary as a conspirator in Darnley's death. They imprisoned her and forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Her son was then crowned James VI of Scotland, and he was taken from her to be raised with a Protestant family. Mary would eventually flee her imprisonment in Scotland, and she headed to England, where she thought her cousin might harbor her. Elizabeth was at first sympathetic to her cousin, and she wanted to restore Mary to the Scottish throne. However, Elizabeth and her advisors feared a strong Scotland, or worse, a Scotland with French support even more, and so they offered Mary sanctuary instead, essentially holding her under house arrest for the next 19 years. While in England, Mary would become the focal point for a series of plots aimed at overthrowing Elizabeth and placing Mary on the English throne. The most famous of these, called the Ridolfi plot after the Florentine banker who was the go-between among the various conspirators, involved not only Mary, allegedly, but also her proposed husband, Thomas, the Duke of Norfolk, who was one of Elizabeth's cousins, Philip, King of Spain, Pope Pius V, Don Hero d'Uspes, the Spanish ambassador to England, the Spanish Duke of Alva, who was then stationed in the Netherlands, and English Bishop John Leslie. Well, perhaps in preparation for moving forward with this plot, Pope Pius V issued a formal excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570, stating in that papal bull that any Catholics who obeyed her were themselves threatened with excommunication. They may have hoped that Catholics in England would revolt. The plot was uncovered in 1571, at which point the Spanish ambassador was expelled, the Duke of Norfolk arrested and executed, and Mary, Queen of Scots, openly held as prisoner. In 1586, the discovery of the Babington plot led Elizabeth to allow the state to try her cousin for treason. Mary was found guilty and executed in 1587. But despite the turmoil at home, Elizabeth was still passionately interested in continental politics, particularly those in France. After all, she'd seemingly succeeded in stopping Catholic plots to overthrow her own reign. Why shouldn't she help Protestant leaders on the continent? In 1561, just a few years after Elizabeth became queen, Charles IX was crowned King of France, after his brother unexpectedly died. As he was 10 at the time, his mother, Catherine de' Medici, served as his regent, while Antoine de Bourbon, who was the Duke of Vendôme and, through marriage, also the King of Navarre — Navarre was a small kingdom between Spain and France — became the Lieutenant General of France. Among the concerns of the time was the spread of Calvinism in France. French Protestants, almost always Calvinist, were called Huguenots, and they'd initially been found only among the middle and lower classes, but by the 1560s, some of France's most powerful noble families were also Huguenots. The undisputed leader of the French Huguenot movement was Queen Jeanne of Navarre, Antoine de Bourbon's wife. She was related to the French royal family through her mother, who had been the sister of King Francis I, the same king who'd formed the Franco-Ottoman alliance. While the marriage between Jeanne and Antoine had been for political reasons, by all accounts Jeanne was passionately in love with her husband. Antoine cared for her, but not enough to stop his own political ambitions, which were to better his position with regards to the French court. Jeanne, however, had publicly declared Navarre a Calvinist kingdom in December of 1560. Antoine had himself been raised as a Protestant. The Bourbons were another well-known Huguenot family, but he switched religions several times, always for politically expedient reasons, and he spent most of his life fighting for the King of France and therefore for the Catholics in France, even doing so fighting against his brother Louis. But Charles's reign was marked with the opening gambits of the French Wars of Religion, which pitted the Huguenot faction, including the Navarre and Bourbon families, against the Catholic League, led by the Guise family, the family related to Mary, Queen of Scots, through her mother. Catherine, Charles's mother, tried to steer a middle course between the two sides as a way to keep the throne for her son until he came of age. In 1562, responding to earlier revolts, the French monarchy made concessions to the Huguenots, but Louis de Bourbon nonetheless acted to take over some Catholic territories, leading to the revocation of those concessions. A war broke out again in 1568, after a group of Huguenots, fearing armed repression, tried to abduct the king. Europe got involved this time. The Dutch Republic, led by the House of Orange, Elizabeth I, and Jeanne of Navarre entered the war on the side of the Huguenots, while Philip II of Spain, Ferdinand, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Pope Pius V supported the Catholics. As an aside, this was the same year that Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne, so you can see why Elizabeth was torn about helping her cousin. Charles, who by 1570 was married and a father, although to an illegitimate son, he had grown weary of war and, apparently, of his mother's interference, and he was increasingly following the advice of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a known Huguenot and leader of the Huguenot army, after the death of Louis de Bourbon. Catherine worried about Coligny's influence, as did Henry, the Duke of Guise, who was convinced that Coligny had masterminded his own father's assassination in 1562. Henry, the Duke of Guise, wanted retaliation. So Catherine and Henry plotted together for a way to rid France of Coligny. In the meantime, a diplomatic solution to the religious warfare was suggested in 1572, a political marriage between Charles's sister Margaret and Henry of Navarre, Antoine de Bourbon's son, and now the King of Navarre, since both of his parents had died. Catherine liked this solution. Henry of Navarre had been baptized a Catholic and, though raised a Protestant because of his mother, his father had been a close confidant of both Catherine's and Charles's. Also, This was an opportunity to ensure that the French royal family had a continuing claim to the Kingdom of Navarre. A nobility on both sides of the religious divide were invited to the wedding in Paris. The wedding on the 18th of August went off beautifully, but 4 days later an attempt was made on the life of Coligny. The visitors, both Huguenot and Catholic, hunkered down, afraid of impending violence and unsure of who exactly was the instigator. On the 24th of August, the Duke of Guise murdered Coligny in his lodgings. The body was thrown to the streets. Parisians, at the time Paris was a very Catholic stronghold, mutilated the corpse. The murder of Coligny opened the floodgates as a somewhat impromptu massacre, known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, erupted. And Henry of Navarre promised to convert to Catholicism, thus avoiding death during the massacre, but it's estimated that up to 10,000 Huguenots lost their lives in the Parisian massacre and in the massacres that followed in neighboring cities. While there's no clear indication that Charles or Catherine had known that the Guise family intended to assassinate Coligny or incite a massacre, Charles nonetheless took responsibility for the event. The last 2 years of his life were filled with recrimination. On his deathbed in 1574, he called Henry of Navarre to him and begged forgiveness. He then asked this cousin to look after his wife and illegitimate son. Charles died at the age of 23. His brother, Henry, the Duke of Anjou, succeeded him as the King of France. Henry III's accession to the French throne thus occurred amid political chaos. The Huguenots were in revolt. The Catholic League, led by the Guise family, urged all-out war. Henry was the fourth son of the royal family. He'd had no hope of inheriting the throne. Accordingly, when the throne of Poland-Lithuania was offered to him unexpectedly in 1573, he jumped at the chance, intending to make his fortune in Eastern Europe. But the death of his brother just a year later meant that he had to return to France and to abdicate the Polish throne. And then he came home to a France immersed in war. Henry had had a difficult reputation within the French court. He helped lead royal forces during the previous wars of religion, but he wasn't considered as worthy as his brother, and he was thought to be more effeminate than them as well. His court favorites included both men and women. He was famous for his mistresses, but his close relationships with men led to raised eyebrows. Some historians believe that Henry may have been bisexual, and the fact that he had both male and female favorites was a pretty good evidence of this. Henry's rule brought England more fully into the fray. Remember, Elizabeth had at one time considered Henry a possible match as her husband. While she may have done it only to play political games, Henry ruined his chances by referring to Elizabeth as an, quote, old creature with a sore leg. There were reports that Elizabeth was limping at that time. Hoping to stop the war, Henry in 1576 issued a series of concessions to the Huguenots, which led to a consolidation of the Catholic League with Spanish support, not just against the Huguenots, but against Henry as well. Henry quickly rescinded the concessions, but to no avail. His situation was made worse when Henry's younger brother Francis died in 1584. Remember, Salic law denies the inheritance of the throne through a woman. As a result, the next closest male heir to Henry was his brother-in-law and cousin, Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot. Henry III, who'd already been married for 9 years, had no children. He had to name his cousin and a Huguenot his heir. The Catholic League intensified its efforts. When the Duke of Guise entered Paris in May of 1588, the Parisians welcomed him, and Henry III fled the city. Now potentially facing a coup, Henry III turned his attention away from the Huguenots and towards destabilizing the dangerous Catholic League. In the summer of 1588, Henry caught a break. The Spanish Armada was defeated by the English, a situation not widely realized until later in the fall when the remnants of the Armada slipped back into port. Given Spain's defeat, Henry suspected that the Spanish weren't going to be able to give the Catholic League as much support as they had, and so he decided to act against the Catholic League. In December of 1588, Henry called Cardinal Louis de Guise to his chateau for Christmas, and he invited Louis's brother, the Duke of Guise, as well. Intimating that he wanted to speak to the Duke in private, he asked Henry to step into another room, where the royal guards murdered him, and then his brother, the cardinal. Henry of Guise's son, his heir, was then arrested. News of the murders shocked Paris and the whole of France, and Henry III was immediately named the culprit. The Parlement of Paris, the royal legal court in the city, was loyal to the Catholic League. They instituted murder charges against Henry III, their own king, forcing Henry to ally with his once enemy and now heir, Henry of Navarre. The two Henrys set up a rival parlement in Tours, made up of men loyal to the king and moderate on the religious issue. Henry III and Henry of Navarre then planned to attack Paris jointly, but in August of 1589, Henry III was attacked by an agent of the Catholic League who stabbed him in the abdomen. As the wound was not at first deemed serious, Henry continued planning through the night. Over the course of the night, however, the condition worsened, and Henry instead sought an oath of loyalty from all of his generals, urging them to support Henry of Navarre should Henry III die. Henry III did in fact die the following day, and when news of his death hit Paris, the people rejoiced, calling his assassination an act of God. However, their rejoicing was short-lived, as Huguenot Henry of Navarre was now the nominal king of France. But Henry IV's road to the throne would be thorny. He had to fight his enemies, the Catholic League, to retake Paris and indeed to take all of France. He did so with military help from Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's involvement greatly annoyed the Catholic League, as she had, not 3 years prior, executed a member of their family, Mary, Queen of Scots. The Catholic League sought to name their own heir to the French throne. They were conscious that this heir had to be a member of the Bourbon family, and so they named as their choice Charles, Henry IV's uncle, who happened to be a Catholic cardinal. The problem? Charles was, in 1589, a prisoner of Henry IV's. Also, Charles renounced the title, and he supported his nephew as King of France. In 1590, Henry attempted to take Paris, but failed, and he came to realize that he'd have to make some personal concessions in order to take control of France. In the summer of 1593, Henry IV took the step of renouncing his Protestant faith and converting to Catholicism. He was probably encouraged to do so by his Catholic mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées. The two were fervently devoted to one another, and despite the fact that Henry IV was married, it was Gabrielle who traveled with him and served as his closest advisor. His renunciation of the Protestant faith disillusioned the Huguenots of France and Elizabeth I, who withdrew her support for his cause. But Henry's willingness to convert allowed the vast majority of France to see him now as their legitimate king. He was crowned the King of France in 1594. 4 years later, Henry IV would issue the Edict of Nantes, which granted concessions of worship and belief to the Huguenots while maintaining the fact that France was absolutely a Catholic kingdom. The end of the French Wars of Religion, officially in 1598, brought about a period of peace in Europe and allowed European monarchs to step back and take a closer look at the new political situation. In England, Elizabeth was still queen. Now 65, she was nearing the end of her reign, but she had managed to secure a Protestant church in England, no longer in question nearly 40 years after the Elizabethan settlement. She had involved England in continental affairs such that England was now a major player in German, Spanish, and French politics, and, thanks to their defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, was an acknowledged naval power. Additionally, she'd supported explorations in the New World and attempted to extend England's commercial interests, even setting up a commercial relationship with Russia. In other words, Elizabeth had successfully finished the transformation of England into a nation-state. And while she'd die in 1603 with no direct heir, she had nonetheless done more to consolidate and centralize power in England in the hands of the monarch since the time of Edward III, and arguably since the time of Henry II. In Spain, Philip II would die in 1598. Under his reign, Spain would reach probably the peak of its power, but also begin to see hints of its downfall. Spain's naval superiority was challenged continuously after 1588. There was a challenge to its control of the Americas, with British and French coming in and taking parts. And there was also a challenge to its European territory, especially after the Dutch began to revolt in the late 1560s. Philip would nonetheless succeed as a pillar of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, particularly in stopping the spread of the Reformation into Spain, in part through the Spanish Inquisition. While Spain was absolutely a nation-state, it remained regionalized, with the nobles of the major areas, such as Castile and Aragon, viewing one another with suspicion. Arguably, that situation remains to this day. In France, Henry IV brought a new dynasty, the Bourbon family, the last dynasty of France, into power, and he ushered in a new religious tolerance as well. He focused on the creation of public works, such as Pont Neuf, and the extension of France's educational system, although that system really was just extended to the upper middle class. It was he who added the gallery to the Louvre Palace, and who first encouraged artists and artisans of all kinds to work on the lower floors of the palace, presaging the Louvre as an artist's gallery. Like Elizabeth, Henry encouraged exploration, although more to the Indian Ocean basin than across the Atlantic, and he involved France in multiple political and military situations across Europe, particularly against the Habsburgs of Austria. However, Henry continued to be a flashpoint for religious fanatics. There were 2 assassination attempts on his life in the 1590s. In both of those cases, the perpetrators were found and executed. In 1610, however, the assassination attempt succeeded. Henry IV was killed, and his son, Louis XIII, who was 9 at the time, became the new king of France. Louis's mother served as regent until 1617. And so it was that religious tensions morphed into political considerations during the 16th century, such that it was sometimes impossible to know whether the originating issue was religious or political in nature. Unsurprisingly, both sides remained convinced of their righteousness, which ultimately meant that religio-political warfare would continue into the 17th century.